Hello and welcome to the Long View. I'm Brendan Long. I'm an academic who's interested in things that are happening in Canberra, particularly at the moment with the impact of the COVID virus. So I'll be conducting a series of podcasts to talk to people about their concerns and to raise policy issues very relevant to the situation. And my first interview, which I'm about to start, is with John Feint, the Canberra-Goulburn Territory President of the St Vincent de Paul Society. So let's go straight away to the interview with John. John, thank you for joining me this morning. As you know, my name's Brendan Long and I am a researcher at the Centre for Christianity and Culture, which is part of Charles Sturt University. And I tend to work on the issues associated with economics and religion, tend to be focusing from a range of different perspectives. But like yourself, I'm, a committed and practicing Catholic. Now you are the territory president of or the president rather of the Canberra-Goulburn Territory Council of St Vincent de Paul. Now, have I got that title right?
You have, Brendan. Yes.
So welcome indeed. I'll give a little bit of biographical. I'm doing this to try to encourage debate about how COVID-19 is affecting us all. And like yourself, I've been in Vincent for many years, but I'm not doing the visits that Vinnies people do so much at the moment. So I was hoping to hear from someone with grassroots experience that's really happening now, like yourself. So I'm a married man with 5 children. Most of them are stuck at home, but I've only got my 19-year-old here with me today, which is good. Otherwise, things would be a bit more chaotic. So tell us a little bit about yourself, John, if you don't mind.
Yes, I've been a Vincentian for about 15 years now. In the Gowrie parish, I started in the Gowrie parish, still a member of the conference here in Tuggeranong in the ACT. A couple of years after that, and became president very quickly, I think, of that conference. And then a couple of years later, I followed Warwick Fulton into the role as president of the Tuggeranong-Monaro Regional Council, which is an interesting role because it covers both ACT and parts of New South Wales. So we're dealing with issues across 2 jurisdictions. And that typifies the work of the Canberra-Goulburn Territory Council, really. Last July, I was then followed Warwick again into the role as Territory Council President. And I went into that role thinking that there were a few things that, I didn't initially. I was I suppose the hand was put up the back a little bit to get me involved, put my hand up. I mean, they were looking for someone to do the role. And I thought at the time, my ambitions were to try and put a younger face, a more youthful face on Vinnies, to deal with Indigenous reconciliation and I guess to have more vital conferences as a part of my agenda. But the summer drought and the bushfires changed everyone's agenda a little. The Canberra-Goulburn region was, and it's important in the context of COVID to understand the bushfires, because Canberra-Goulburn region, we had 1,230 or thereabouts, I think, properties that were severely affected or destroyed in our region across many weeks. And we're still dealing with, and will continue to deal with, the ramifications of that for a number of years. And then we start to sort of get ourselves in a position where we're managing the bushfire relief and recovery process, and the COVID-19 happened. So I still do conference work in my local conference, but I do also a lot of remote bushfire relief work at the moment. I think I've got 6 people to talk to after this conversation
Wow.
who are seeking assistance for relief, and probably deal with, well, it varies each week, but quite a lot each week still, as we're thinking about what the next phase of our recovery work will be. That work has been exacerbated by COVID, obviously.
Yeah.
Isolation becomes a much stronger factor in people's lives, and it delays recovery from the other traumas they've had through bushfires, which were both, in our case, on the coast and then up around the Batlow, Adlong, Tumbarumba region, where we had significant impacts as well across our region, and even just to the south of Canberra. I guess as a community, we're sort of psychologically adapted a bit to bushfires, because we had the 2003 bushfires in Canberra with such devastating results. And I was working for ACT government at that time, and in the environment area, and spent 3 years doing bushfire recovery after those fires. And so it brought back a lot of that to a lot of our people in our community here, what they'd gone through in terms of trauma and unsettledness, I suppose, as a result of that, and the weeks and weeks of smoke that we had in Canberra and this region. So did that put us in a good place to then think about how we were going to deal with and respond to COVID? It did at one level. We were already working at a heightened level. The Territory Council, in I think contrast to perhaps some of the other boards in the other states, is very actively involved through its membership as members of that board in the actual relief work. We have a subset of the Territory Council, which is a bushfire task force, and essentially those same people have then moved on essentially to also look at the COVID-19 situation and how we deal with it. Obviously, there's impacts on our companions, and there's impacts on our society and on our organisation. We have gradually adapted, based on the advice of government, to how that works, to being more and more working from home. Very early in the piece, our contingency planning meant that we worked to A and B teams, and we're still working A and B teams. So that was the first level, was to deal with distancing and contact. Very soon after, I wrote to all conferences in our region, saying that anyone over 70 was not to be visiting people, that we were then to start thinking about strategies for limiting contact with companions, as we're moving into the phase where people were being asked to stay at home. And so we still run conferences, but we run those as a telephone service, and dropping off stuff to the driveway service. Some things, I mean, this week I bought a fridge for a companion. Appliances online do a very good job working with people. They could keep their distance in the property. They've got very good procedures and protocols, so we feel confident about their service to companions. So we have a number of our centres still open as part of the Canberra Relief Network, staffed by those members of staff who are happy to do so, but under the strict social distance rules, number of people in each centre, etc., as places where people can come and get essentials, clothing and the like, and food.
That's an amazing service that you're doing, John. And I mean, as a Vinnies always is there to help out, and has for many years. I mean, one of the things that the magic or the charism rather of the Vinnies model for me always was that personal connection that people make with other people who, as you say, are companions really on the journey, rather than that's a really good way to describe them. I imagine when the sort of message came through that you could no longer visit, that must have hit the Vinnies volunteers pretty hard. would have got a
Yes,
bit
it did
gut-wrenching.
certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I spoke and to a lot, and I think why, and I guess it works differently, as you probably appreciate. In the ACT, we home visit
Yeah.
mostly, 99%. Very few people come to us to talk, whereas in the country, in our country conferences, it works the other way around.
Yeah.
And people come into an office, often associated with a centre, for a discussion about the needs that they have.
Yeah.
And so, but the common theme, as you say, is face to face. Yeah, so I did speak to a lot, and a lot rang me about it and were concerned. But
Yeah.
I said, okay, there's two ways to look at this. We wait for people to come to us, or we reach out to people. And a lot of the contact that we have with people in our conference, and I'm trying to encourage this in lots of conferences, is to ring those who are isolated, to keep in touch. Don't wait for people to call for assistance necessarily. You can be a bit more proactive. I always said Frederick Osnam didn't wait for people to call him.
Yeah.
That first conference, they went out and saw where the need was.
So in effect, you're saying, John,
in some ways that actually was quite a comfort for those older members, because they could see themselves as very active members on the phone, talking to people.
What's interesting there is that, the adaptability of the model. It looks, from what you're saying, is that Vinnies has found itself flexible enough to be able to change sometimes its long-established practices to be able to respond, to the new conditions of COVID, which is impressive. But there must be sticking points. I mean, there must be points of frustration, maybe things that government could do better, or maybe just things that it's possible to change to facilitate the role. I mean, that you do, particularly as you mentioned earlier, we're hearing a lot about this, people struggling emotionally at the moment, with isolation. Just finished 2 weeks. School holidays with the kids, and they're all suffering from isolation. But I mean, for those really suffering, how are we going with that challenge?
It is a major challenge in our community, and maybe two things. I mean, obviously, a lot of the people that we work with who are isolated in that way aren't necessarily tech savvy. They're not likely to be getting on the Zoom and talking to people. I mean, they all have a phone, and I guess to me it's saying there's a lot of value in the social connection that we have with people, as much as the food and the other physical things that we provide people. And it's probably, to some extent, I hope, may shift some of the emphasis in the way we assist people. And maybe in the future, the governments could look at where they position people to help in the community, or fund us or others to improve the social engagement that we have with people in our communities. I mean, the sort of programs that we run at the moment are self-funded in that area.
Yeah, that's excellent. And look, from what everyone's saying, even though in ACT in particular, and even in immediately regional New South Wales near us, the COVID infection rates obviously dropping dramatically, but still there's no immediate indication that the long-term economic effects are not going to hang around for quite some time. And even though social isolation measures will decrease, they're still going to be present in some form for some time. So
I agree. We're seeing a drop off at the moment in calls to our call centre, and I think that's partly due to the fact that people have got extra money through Centrelink. Those people that rely on welfare payments,
job
keeper and job seeker and all that sort of thing happening. But what we're concerned about is when that tapers off, when that funding, the impact of that funding and that assistance we're going to get a rebound effect and a lot more calls for assistance.
Yeah, and it's going to be, and that raises a really interesting policy challenge for government too, in that when we give people these extra funds, and you've said interestingly that you're noticing the positive, the fact that you're not getting as many calls.
But it might also be people conscious of the fact that they're in isolation as well and not wanting to call now, so they're saving it up as well.
Right.
I think there's two factors. Yeah.
So in the immediate anecdotal evidence seems to suggest from what you're saying that increase in payments seems to be related to a reduction in calls for assistance. So what's going to happen then is the government's going to face a very difficult choice in, say, 6 months' time, when they've realised that the higher payment rate has been well received and needed by people in genuine need. They're going to have to make that decision as to whether they're going to go back to the old lower rate, which I, as an economist and religious researcher, argue has traditionally been far too low.
Particularly things like New Start.
And so they're going to have that difficult decision. But it's interesting already that the evidence is that you're seeing some benefit from the increased payment rates already in people's lives.
I mean it's that's true, and but I'm just not sure how it'll play out. I mean, I think if they can increase New Start, which is something we've been campaigning as a society for ages.
Yeah, sure.
I don't think the government will see it as returning to the old. I think there'll be a new paradigm, I think, for the way social funding and assistance is provided after the COVID. I think sadly we need a disaster to sometimes shift.
And that's the great line of Obama's former chief advisor, never waste a good crisis, but in terms of being able to bring forward reform. But what's interesting, and I find frustrating actually, even though I'm an economist, is that you've got the business community, you've got the mining lobby, you've got a bunch of parts of the country saying, oh, look, this has got to be now a chance for the crack at tax reform, industrial relations reform, and so forth. Well, that's fair enough. But yet again, why not also see this now as a chance to really reform the structure of the income support system?
Yeah, I mean, the social wage and all those things that
we've almost got sort of this guaranteed minimum income thing going on at the moment, which is this sort of...
I mean, that's a sort of very Scandinavian thing.
And Bernie Sanders into it too,
I'm definitely no economist. My background's definitely not, even though I worked in public policy for 40 odd years, only retiring last year, but that was more on the environment and water space.
But it's interesting, and it's just something to think about, that we've actually moved towards this world of where we've largely increased the payment level. And, when you look at the combination of this JobKeeper and JobSeeker allowance, when you add the family tax benefit to the JobSeeker, it's about the same as the JobKeeper, mucking around somewhere between the $1,300 to $1,500 a fortnight rate. So we sort of benchmark that as, at the moment, so to speak, as a sort of where we are as the minimum sort of income at the moment. And that's basically double or close to double of what it was 2 months ago. So
I mean, and the government gets, you correct me or the economist, the government gets some of that back. People go and spend that money. They're not going to save it.
Yeah.
And the GST comes back on all the products people purchase. I mean, it must help with economic activity.
For every dollar you give a person in wage, you tend to get about $2.50 back in terms of economic activity. And then of which 30% of that usually flows back to the government through taxes, right? They're the big headline numbers. But it's just interesting for me that first interesting thing was to hear you say that already you're seeing, the effect. And secondly, how we're going to have to journey with people when the government decides perhaps to cut it back if it decides to cut it back, and the shock that that's going to have, could be really traumatic. I'd love to have go on.
Yeah. I know. I was going to say we could have another catch up a bit further down the track and see when we later in the year know what it looks like a bit more. I mean, the other thing for us, I mean, you're focusing a bit on conferences, I suppose, in COVID, is our traditional model of conferences. With COVID, I think is an opportunity to then look again at how we construct conferences and how that all works. As you're very much aware, we have an aging membership in our conferences, and I know New South Wales is very keen on setting targets about making more youthful conferences, and we need to look at that ourselves, and I suppose channel people who are of any age into the work that's best suited to them, and that they will provide opportunities across the spectrum. Obviously, when people are young and busy with families, being a conference member is not necessarily the best place to be. But and we create, and because they got other things on.
Remind me, I used to coach cricket teams and then have to leave the game to go and do a visit. But
a lot of people are. I mean, I'm a bit the same, but I mean, we're probably compulsive volunteers, so there's a difference. But there is a sense of making volunteering part of normal life, which is what we're sort of talking about in some ways. But also, we have in our institutional sort of frameworks things which are a bit strange. We have a thing called members, and we have a thing called volunteers. And essentially, in a legal sense, they're all members, actually, under work health and safety legislation or whatever. And so it's a question about, well, what is your career in Vinnies going to look like through your life, really? From a mini Vinnies person in a school working on, issues concerned about social justice and all those sort of things as they do, a lot of work, right through to at the other end of your life when you're part of a Bailey's conference where prayer and phone contact is your main work that you do. And a spectrum right through that, which might mean in some time that you're spending looking after homelessness on the night patrol, or you're doing work in a centre, or you're in conferences. We tend to compartmentalise things a lot, but at the same time, we don't recognise that a lot of people actually do work both as members and volunteers with different hats on at different times. And we get a bit hung up on, all our conference members are aging. Well, that's because we don't see the total resource that we have in our society that can lend assistance to the work that a conference needs to do, or, so it's starting to think in a slightly different way about how we marshal the resources that we have and use the technology, which this COVID is making us much more aware of, to help us keep in touch and to manage things and organise ourselves. I think I'm excited about a new order into the future. I think there's a lot of discussion about, well, there's certainly discussion about that at the National Council, which when you're president at this Territory Council level, all of a sudden you take on another role as part of the National Council, which is a broader strategic role. And we've been working recently on a new strategic plan. I had the privilege of working on that as part of a small team, which will be now working with the National Council to finalise. And a lot of the things we just discussed are sort of part of what we're trying to think about in nationally as a society, as much as just in our Canberra-Goulburn area.
That's excellent. I think, interesting to see how, like a crisis can bring forward innovation, and
it pushes things faster, I think,
Well, this is more the religious thinker in me than the economist coming out now, but I mean, it's like, just writing a piece at the moment about hope in affliction, and it's we've got a situation of death in the world, not so bad in Australia, but 73,000 or whatever dead in America, but so there's an experience of death, but still, even in that, there is you know, sometimes there's also an experience of life as well. And, you know, you're just saying, look, adapting to the new world, the COVID world, has implications for the way Vinnies functions, and actually leads potentially to, you know, encourage or stimulate, you know, those sort of reforms to the institution that were probably going to happen anyway, but, you know, sort of leads to that innovation. So, you know, good comes out of evil sometimes, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot more people talking to each other than probably before COVID, across the organisation, nationally and locally.
And parents
surprisingly,
spend a little bit more time with their kids too. I'm not sure if I don't know if dad's a good teacher or not, but as far as the kids are concerned, but at least that's happening. John, it's a privilege to talk to you. Hopefully we will have a chance to hook up with you a bit later to see how things are tracking when COVID gets, say, more serious in 3 or 4 months' time. And it'd be
thanks, Brendan. I'll just comment that we have had to stand down some people. We have, etc.
Oh yeah.
So
interesting.
And all the staff are working 4-day weeks at the moment.
Right. Yeah.
From the CEO down. So there are some financial adaptations, business adaptations we've had to make. Not as tough as, say, South Australia, who stood down a significant number of their people. We've tried to take a Vincentian approach to that and looking after each individual. We're smaller, we can maybe adapt a bit easier.
It's a challenge facing a lot of church institutions at the moment, and not just church ones, but I think the whole of the charitable sector is, facing problems of revenue, and that unfortunately does affect.
It took us nearly a month to sort out with the federal government to reduce from 30 to 50% the reduction in turnover trigger for us to access JobKeeper. So that having got that made a big difference, because we were looking at quite, running insolvent in a few months if we hadn't had that.
Right, that's interesting. So that's interesting, and
that's how serious it's been for us. Yeah,
that's and not just you, from what I'm hearing. I mean, the Treasurer put out another press release late on last Friday, indicating that there's a range of charities facing the same constraints, including some international charities as well. So it's because a lot of our funding. Well, they were trying to count all the funding that we got from governments to, which is tied. We can't use it for other things. And they seem to be giving you the flexibility to be able to either include that or not include that. Depends.
No, we've got that now. Yeah, which is good.
Yeah. Okay. John, that's tremendous. And thank you very much for being generous with your time. I look forward to talking to you some time later on. I'll also probably take the opportunity to speak to my friend Toby O'Connor, who I used to work for at Catholic Welfare Australia, now Catholic Social Services Australia. And I'll get the national perspective from him, and it'll be interesting.
Oh, you'll get the full bottle there,
I know Toby well, and it'll be interesting to compare the national perspective with the grassroots perspective. But the grassroots perspective is always very, very welcome.